Mindful Life Transformations. I'm Chaplain Bob Wade, licensed master social worker and spiritual life coach. Now, I've added the chaplain to my title because I have just completed my ordination with St. Luke's Evangelical Christian Ministries. And this, along with my ordination as a Jedi from the Universal Life Church Ministries, will give you one of the most spiritually inclusive communities on the internet. Speed this up just a smidge. Also, Mindful Life Transformations as an online spiritual community will continue to strive to be the most trauma-informed, inclusive, spiritually minded community on the internet. In a future video, I will hope to explain what I believe a Christian Jedi is. But for this week, I want to concentrate and continue our talk about the first step of Alcoholics Anonymous, which is we admit we are powerless over our issues, that our lives have become unmanageable. This first step is really about acceptance and surrender. It's about admitting that the issue, and not you, is what's in control of your life. Acceptance can be misunderstood as either approval or giving up, but neither of these could be further from the truth. You don't need to approve of what you accept, nor do you need to be happy with it. So think of acceptance as bringing my emotions into equilibrium, so no matter what, or no matter what happens to me, either good or bad, I will meet it with the same calm acceptance. I will recognize what is in my realm of control and what isn't, and working within those ever-fluxing parameters determines how best to proceed. We accept life on life's terms because serenity will remain forever out of reach until we do that. Now, apart from abstaining from drinking and using drugs, the program of recovery outlined in the steps suggests that we accept where we're at and ultimately look towards the future with courage and hope. Giving up an old way of dying for a new way of living, as we say. I regard my ongoing spiritual awakening as one of living in acceptance, living in the present, engaging in today's activities, and understanding that we do not have the promise of tomorrow. I find that life is much more manageable when I can accept what I have to work with and make the most of today's trials and joys. It makes little sense to me, but in surrendering, you become spiritually free. Now, I know what you're saying and I know what you're thinking. How can surrendering help me win and be free? I thought the exact same thing. So a quote from Eckhart Tolle says, we surrender to what is. We say yes to life and see how life suddenly starts working for you rather than against you. Now, surrender in the current colloquial language equals failure. But according to the Oxford Dictionary, without an object, surrender means to stop resisting to an enemy or opponent and submit to their authority. With an object, it gets even worse. You give up or hand over a person, right, or possession, typically on compulsion or demand. Now, this doesn't sound like you're winning. So what I want you to do is I want you to think of this surrender as a total commitment to what you want to do to make your life better. Chip Ingram said, total surrender is the channel through which God's best and biggest blessings flow. So what does that mean? What does total commitment mean? The definition of total commitment is the alignment of one's motives, resources, priorities, and goals to fulfill a specific mission, to accomplish a specific task, or to follow a specific person. So we make a total commitment to ourselves, and we look to overcome any shame and live our lives in the service of others, because that's the only life that truly makes an impact. And we're going to look at those 10 steps for practicing radical acceptance again. And that first step is observe that you are fighting against reality. Now, for example, you say things as, well, it shouldn't be like this. And many times this means we're using a cognitive distortion. So what is a cognitive distortion? It's a thinking error. Sometimes it can be called polarized thinking, or this can also be called all or nothing or black and white thinking. And this distortion occurs when people habitually think in extremes, when you're convinced that you're either destined for success or doomed for failure, that the people in your life are either angelic or they're evil. You're probably engaged in polarized thinking. Now, this kind of distortion is unrealistic, and it's often unhelpful, because reality really exists somewhere in between. Then you have overgeneralization. When people overgeneralize, they reach a conclusion about one event, and then they apply that incorrect conclusion, or they incorrectly apply that conclusion across the board. So, for example, if you're in school and you made a low score on a math test, and you could just conclude that you're hopeless at math. You've had a negative experience in one relationship, and that develops a belief that you aren't good at relationships at all. Now, overgeneralization has been associated with post-traumatic stress disorder and other anxiety disorders. Catastrophizing. This distortion type of thinking leads people to dread or assume the worst when facing the unknown. It's the everything is going to be bad. So when we catastrophize, ordinary worries can quickly escalate. So, for example, an expected check doesn't arrive in the mail. A person who catastrophizes may begin to show fear that it will never arrive. And as a consequence, they won't be able to pay their rent, they won't be able to feed their family, they're going to be evicted, and they're going to die a starving death. Now, it's easy to dismiss catastrophizing as a hysterical overreaction, but people who have developed this cognitive distortion may have experienced repeated adverse events, like chronic pain or childhood trauma, so often that they fear the worst in many situations. Another common thinking error is taking things personally when they're not connected to or caused by you at all. And this is called personalization. Now, you may be engaging in this type of cognitive distortion when you blame yourself for circumstances that aren't your fault or are beyond your control. Another example is when you incorrectly assume that you've been intentionally excluded or targeted. Personalization has been associated with heightened anxiety and depression. And then there's mind reading. When people assume they know what others are thinking, they're resorting to mind reading. And it can be hard to distinguish between mind reading and empathy. And empathy is the ability to perceive and understand what others may be feeling in that moment. So to tell the difference between the two, it might be helpful for you to consider all of the evidence and not just the evidence that confirms what you're thinking. And at least one study has found that mind reading is more common among children than among adolescents or adults, and is often associated with anxiety. Another distorted thought pattern is the tendency to ignore positives and focus exclusively on the negatives. And this is called mental filtering. Interpreting circumstances using a negative mental filter is not only inaccurate, it can worsen anxiety and depression symptoms. Now, researchers have found that having a negative perspective on yourself and your future can cause feelings of hopelessness. And these thoughts may become extreme. And they can become extreme enough to trigger suicidal thoughts. I'm going to move ahead. And these cognitive distortions will get you into a spot to where with your errors in thinking, you become less apt to handle life on life's terms. Now, that was the first point. The second is to remind yourself that I cannot change an unpleasant reality. The serenity prayer states, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Thirdly, acknowledge that something led to this moment. Now, an example of that is this is how it happened. Many times, we are the main reason that something happens to us. It's the choices we make. Sometimes we're in the wrong place at the wrong time, or we give our trust to someone who doesn't deserve it. But something led us to this moment in our lives, and we cannot change the past, no matter how much we would want to. Fourthly, we have to practice acceptance with not only your mind, but your body and spirit. Be mindful of your breath, your posture. Use the rain meditation, and you can go to last week's Contemplation and practice, or go to my podcast, the Meditation Chamber, and download the guided rain meditation there to remind yourself of this practice until you get the hang of it. Fifthly, list what your behavior would look like if you did accept the facts and then act accordingly. Ask yourself the question, if I were to accept what has happened, how would this change my life in the present? Sixth, plan ahead with events that seem unacceptable and think about how you should appropriately cope. Now, this means being aware of your triggers. What makes you want to go back to old habits? So write each of these down and then plan on how you want to deal with them. 7. Remain mindful of physical sensations throughout your body, such as tension or stress. Complete a body scan, and when you notice a place of tension or stress, use the technique of progressive muscle relaxation to help relieve that tension. Number 8, embrace feelings such as disappointment, sadness, or grief as just a part of life. We will all have moments of disappointment in our lives. We will be sad sometimes, or we will need to grieve. We need to remind ourselves that these times will pass. Now, they may pass like a kidney stone, but they will pass. Number 9, acknowledge that life is worth living even when there might be temporary pain. On that list where you're listing your triggers, also list the reasons you have to live. And then number 10, if you find yourself resisting, complete a pros and cons exercise to better understand the full impact of your choice. Radical acceptance will help with the first step on the spiritual path, realizing that we all have issues, but those issues don't have to have us. Now, next week, we'll look at step 2. And step 2 is, we came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. In step 2 of AA, participants acknowledge and accept a higher power, God or otherwise, and admit that only this higher power can remove their obsession with what causes issues in their lives. And we'll look more at that next week. So make sure you click like and subscribe, ring the mindful bell for notifications when new videos post. Tell your friends, tell your enemies, tell everybody you can about these weekly talks. And remember, clicking like, clicking subscribe, it may seem like a little thing to you, but it does really help the channel. And it helps us get our message of positivity and trauma-informed inclusivity out there to the masses. Until our next talk, this is Bob with Mindful Life Transformations reminding you to stay awesome.